I believe in the status quo and think more of the same would be good for our country. The media is honest and is an excellent source of information. Now is not the time to rock the boat. We need to stay the course. There is no better role model than Hillary Clinton. The recent hacks and leaks are the result of Russian espionage and can't be trusted.
People want to live in peace. They don't want to walk into a bank or get on a train and die because of a bomb put there by some unknown killer.
With the Piazza Fontana massacre in 1969, one of the darkest periods of Italian history began. Some historians now believe it formed part of a semi-official secret project known as the Strategy of Tension.
What is terrorism? Listen.
We must first understand an important clandestine operation which is commonly known as Operation Gladio.
For 40 years, secret terrorist organizations, many trained by Western intelligence agencies, have manipulated the political control of Europe.
A strategy of tension is being employed.
Secret agents carry out an act of terrorism, which is then blamed on the enemy of choice.
Destabilize the public order, to stabilize the political order, and justify a repressive intervention that would be welcomed with relief by the population.
Terrorism, which is then blamed on the enemy of choice.
Many different groups took an active role in this fourth phase of the fight against communism. Among them was the Italian stay-behind network Gladio, parts of which now became directly involved in domestic political subversion.
The strategy of tension is at play in the black-white issue in America. It's at play in the push for mass migration. It's embedded in the terrorism subplot as well. There's a kind of a pattern to these Gladio type of situations. This is basically just a quick rundown of some of the recognizable components of the pattern here.
First, an official narrative is quickly agreed upon and blames either lone nuts or the enemy du jour. Second, lone nuts die shortly after the event and or have no chance to explain their side of the story. Next, the number of reported perpetrators decreases as the official narrative unfolds. Evidence which is quickly destroyed or made inaccessible to journalists or the public because of national security. Obviously, prefabricated statements, responses which are made far too quick, exploiting the target's moment of psychological shock. Politicians and commercially controlled media, blaming the designated culprit before any investigation, using hate speech, revenge, threats of war or sanctions, and fostering police-state legislation. You will see name changes or misspelling of suspected lone nuts and or suppression of intelligence links as they emerge. You will see imagery of low quality with mismatching details in different versions or viewing angles, timestamp inaccuracies, presented evidence and history of the lone nut containing bold archetypes, letters, testaments, even passports. Lost and found ID creates a direct trail to allow the official narrative's perpetrators to be identified. You find eyewitness accounts incompatible with press reports. You have the commercially controlled media resentful of any serious criticism of its own early reporting, citing mostly sources from government, so-called experts, police or news agencies like Reuters and Associated Press. You have official investigations avoided, delayed, or flawed due to deaths, refusal to answer questions, or accepting bogus proofs. You find a media blackout regarding targets and intelligence services foreknowledge and or facts that don't fit the official narrative. Any ideas apart from this are termed conspiracy theories and dismissed by the establishment.
Very good list.
It's a pretty good list.
One piece that sort of in the macro way makes sense of why a lot of these attacks don't make sense is the random or the soft aspect of the targeting. If this really were a war on terror between terrorists and the West, the terrorists would be targeting hard targets, of symbols of the actual war itself, not people on the promenade or gay guys at a nightclub. None of this holds together other than this global logic of making everybody feel that they're potentially under assault. But of course, this is what the neoconservatives and their Leo Strauss legacy and lineage would call a clash of civilizations. And as anyone from Rahm Emanuel to William Bratton would say, if you don't have a crisis to take advantage of, then you generate a crisis. So thinking about the actual Samuel Huntington Clash of Civilizations treatise, or the Straussians, they believe that politics is all about enmity and of warring factions, and that if you don't have enemy images, then humanity goes soft. That's sort of like their bottom line in a way. The former neoconservative Francis Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History. After the fall of communism, the only thing left is liberal democracy. And of course, that was a contrived argument from the beginning because we had serious, deep economic and ecological crises to be faced across the entire planet. But the neoconservatives sought a new century of endless conflict and enmity and the clash of civilizations and wars and terrors and terror of wars. They termed it a project for a new American century. But many of them had dualistic or first allegiance to a certain conception of Israel. That's why they targeted nations that had leaders that were seen as potential conflict with the Israeli regime. But in a larger macro concept there, the war on terror, the long war as it was termed by some people, serves a purpose, a global social purpose of organizing humanity in terms of its conflict and its enmity and its inter-ethnic warfare. And meanwhile, many of us have other ideas, and I think competition is a really important piece of human instinct, but so is cooperation. And really, the best competitors are not neoconservative so-called intellectuals. In fact, they hide behind deception. They are not willing to discuss their actual ideas except with each other. They're an inbred so-called intellectual elite. They are in a bubble. They use deception because the rest of us who are profane cannot understand how the wise men need to organize our society. Some of us understand that competition is at its best when it's out in the open. It's the competition of art. Hip-hop is a great example. The 4 elements of hip-hop. Who's the best breakdancer? Who's the best artist with the spray can in hand? Who can break you down with the word in a paragraph? Who can make a beat so deep that it'll knock your head back? That's hip-hop competition. That's global competition. That, of course, also goes into sports or in art. Everybody knows that competition drives human creativity. We don't do it because of competition, but it drives us to our highest self. That's the real alternative here. And the best of business, the best of entrepreneurship takes advantage of and throttles that deep human instinct to compete for our own highest aspirations and puts it towards creating value for many humans. There's alternative narratives here. But one group, if you want to term them the neoconservatives or the Straussians or the Clashers or whatever you want to call them, they like their ERs. They believe in a small group of what they think of as wise men who can handle what they believe is the inevitable truth of the masses of humans not being able to handle their own sovereignty, dignity, freedom, autonomy, and believe that they need to be organized by international, inter-ethnic enmity. But fuck them. Fuck that shit. We have other ideas, and I'm willing to debate it out in the open with them. I asked David Frum when he was at UCLA about why he was a neoconservative. He batted at our camera. He asked a nice young lady in her 20s on a golf cart and saying that he needed help because these guys were harassing him because we were asking him questions. You know, on one side, we have like a group of 20, 30 guys who have jobs at think tanks in D.C. trying to organize mass murder on behalf of the rest of us. Fuck them, dude. They need to be held accountable to the facts of our situation. The rest of us have some better ideas, and we're willing to actually be honest about them and debate them in public.
The problem with their ideology is that they portray human engagement in civilization as a zero-sum game to be won. And competition is generally a very beautiful thing, like you've described, unless you're convinced that you're playing a zero-sum game, wherein if someone else wins, you lose utterly. In order for you to win, you have to demolish everyone else. So in order for America to have another prosperous century, it has to defeat prosperity in every other situation or every other country. Civilization is not a zero-sum game. There are just some power politicians and ideologues who are hell-bent on convincing us of that, so we'll fall into their nefarious plots. But really, you know, you mentioned sports. The Lakers might be trying to beat the Celtics, but as long as the NBA continues to be a profitable enterprise, salaries will keep increasing no matter who wins the game. So competition in that realm takes a very friendly sort of temperament, where you don't have the Lakers trying to actually kill the Celtics because only one can win, you know. Competition usually creates a beneficial situation for all involved through that competition, unless you're playing a zero-sum game, wherein competition is a fight to the death, more or less. And we need to reject that kind of Manichaean worldview.
A fight to the death by someone else's children. If you're talking to the neocons, most of them.
It's a very realpolitik strategy. If you're going to engage in combat, you might as well do it with someone else's lives.
Shit.
It's a good game if you can win it.
There's no winners in that game. Yeah.
Tell that to Kellogg Root.
Yeah.
Or OPEC.
Yeah.
People do win from these games. It's just that everyone else has to lose in order for them to win.
And they win in the short term. Meanwhile, their souls lose in the long term and their grandchildren lose in the midterm.
You have to have a soul to lose a soul.
We must gain our souls.
Simply to squander them.
Cast my soul before swine.
For Odin. For Thor. For the Mujahideen.
Hashtagistan.
Wahhabism. Wahhabism. Wahhabism.
Wahhabism. Wahhabism. Wahhabism. Wahhabism.
Wahhabism.
At the end of the Second World War, President Roosevelt traveled to the Great Bitter Lake in the middle of the Suez Canal. At the same time, he sent another American warship to pick up the King of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz. The meeting of King and President was to have powerful and disastrous consequences both for the West and, in a strange way, for Afghanistan. Roosevelt was dying, but over the last 13 years, he had used his power on an epic scale to transform the world. After the Wall Street crash and the terrible depression that followed, Roosevelt had taken charge. He had passed laws that broke up the banks, so they would never run out of control again. And he had rebuilt America with a series of giant dams that brought electrical power and employment to millions of people. And he had planned and fought a world war against Germany and Japan. Now, as Roosevelt sat waiting for Abdulaziz, no one could possibly have imagined the consequences of this meeting. For it was going to unleash forces that in the future would undermine everything that Roosevelt had worked for. His belief that politicians should use their power in a planned way to reshape the world. But Roosevelt knew that to keep that power, America needed oil. and he wanted to forge an alliance with the king to make sure that the vast Saudi oil fields remained under American control. In their conversation, the two men laid the foundations for an alliance that continues to the present day. America would get its oil, and in return, Saudi Arabia would receive wealth and security from America. But the king was well aware of the dangers of opening up his country to the influence of the modern West. And in the negotiations that followed, he laid down a condition. "We will take your technology and your money," he said, "but you must leave our faith alone." The Saudi faith was called Wahhabism. It was a radical, violent, and extremely puritanical form of Islam. And its followers among the Bedouin tribes hated the modern world. Wahhabism was part of a wider movement in Islam that had risen up in reaction to the European empires. Another was the Deobandi movement in India. They all believed that modern imperialism was corrupting the true nature of Islam and wanted to go back to a world based on the original teachings of the Islamic texts. Abdulaziz had harnessed this force in the 1920s to seize power. But he had unleashed something that didn't want to stop. The Wahhabists wanted to go on and create a caliphate across the whole of the Arab world. And to stop them, in 1929, Abdulaziz machine-gunned them. He ruthlessly killed the warriors who had made him king. But their belief, a violent, intolerant, and above all backward-looking version of Islam, remained at the heart of Saudi Arabian society. And the deal made that day on the Great Bitter Lake meant that America would get its oil, but it would also be protecting Wahhabism, a force that had its own global ambitions. Ambitions that were very different from America's.
What I know about Wahhabism is very basic. It was a sect of Islam that was created in the mid-1700s by this cat named Sheikh Ibn Wahhab, and sort of got popular through the House of Saud. And the West has been sort of promoting it throughout that entire region, sort of stirring the pot for what I'd say a majority of Muslims would say is not Islam. There's a lot of people in the Western media who say that Islam needs a reformation. It just doesn't need Wahhabism. There's already been a reformation in Islam, and a lot of people would argue that it was Sufism, which a lot of people call the mystical offshoot of Islam, but it was kind of something a lot of people would incorporate into their Sunnism or their Shia teachings. But I think it's something that's been promoted in the Middle East by the West because it's pretty much been instrumental in dumbing down everybody. It's pretty much anti-education, anti-women, anti-everything. So there's no growth from that kind of ideology.
The history of largely the British Empire in terms of propping up or this choosing of very specific sects, or in the case of Saudi Arabia, actual, tribal families, to be their proxy in the region is pretty well recognized at this point. A lot of the debate has to do with whether it's still a proxy situation. And yes, there's obvious ongoing reformations in the global Islamic society in all its different regional and sect-based differences, the same as any human group at this point. But large portions of the Islamic Reformation or Enlightenment took place before the Christian Reformation. You see some of that in the Sufi tradition, where it was very much Islamic. but it was also very eclectic, and it was able to move across boundaries, geographical boundaries, but also cultural and spiritual practices from different groups. So that was, instead of a clash of civilizations, that was some type of harmony of civilizations, or a beautiful cacophony of civilizations that the Sufis were after. And that's a long, long tradition. Meanwhile, you have Saudi Arabia, and I think many people have pointed out, it's like saying the Bush United States, the utilization of the Saudis as a major oil-based proxy of the West in that area is becoming clearer and clearer in every day. And their relationship with the Israelis is becoming clearer and clearer every day. But somehow they're allies. And obviously the United States is an ally with Saudi Arabia. So there's something else going on here. Once I termed this an issue of un-Islamo-Nazis in bed with Zionist nihilist supremacists in bed with not-so-Christo, not-so-crypto fascists. And so those are the pseudo-religious dimensions of this clash of civilizations. And of course there's this overlay of some type of Luciferian oligarchical strain that likes to play in mass trauma, that likes to set up people against each other. I'm sure there's Salafists and Takfiris and Wahhabists of different strains who would make the argument that they want to be and are a part of an Islamic renaissance. But meanwhile, the proxy forces of the worst elements of the West are being run, it appears, through Wahhabism.
Definitely, yeah. It's kind of how I see the Wahhabism as an answer to Sufism.
Ratcheting it up a notch here, and that's really unfortunate because the entire Muslim world needs unity right now more than ever.
And what can you elaborate a little bit more on the Wahhabi ideology and how it's influenced or impacted global terrorism?
It's been a source of not just terrorism, but it's also been a perfect patsy for those forces in the Western world, led by the Zionist extremists around Netanyahu, who want to demonize Islam and convince the world that Muslims are terrorists. And because this Wahhabi ideology can be so fanatical, those people who are very unsophisticated and can be very violent and extremist have fallen into the trap of playing the role of Muslim terrorists on television, basically. And this has worked against Islam. We've had an Islamic awakening going on for decades now. And the backlash from the enemies of Islam has been able to use this Wahhabi movement to convince the world that there is such a problem with Islamic activism. And there isn't. Islamic activism, by and large, all over the world is a positive force for change in the right direction. But this extremist Wahhabi obscurantism that revels in ignorance and openly calls for killing people who don't have the right religious beliefs and practices. This is something that's almost disappeared from the civilized world today, but we still hear this from certain quarters of Saudi Arabia. And it's very unfortunate when leading figures like this imam, or whatever he calls himself, put out this kind of outrageous rhetoric. I mean, this is basically a call to murder people based on their nationality and presumably based on their madhab, or school of Islamic law. And it's completely unacceptable, and the people of Iran and the Muslims of the world deserve an apology.
And unfortunately, many in the world today are judging Islam by the example set by the Wahhabi/Salafist ideology. Thank you, Dr. Kevin Barrett, once again for joining us on the program. Editor at Veterans Today, joining us out of Madison, Wisconsin.
Jeremy, you were talking about the class of civilizations model and how it's kind of a contrived problem. And Music Library brought up Sufism. And it's a clear fact testifying to what you guys are saying, in that Rumi is the most read poet in all of the West. Without any provocation, the West has very naturally fallen in love with the ideas and the writing of Rumi, a Sufi. But the West also seems pretty universally opposed to all the writings and actions and deeds and opinions of the Wahhabists. I think this topic is very important because people don't understand the complexity and difference between the two. A lot of times you hear people criticizing Islam these days. It's because they don't understand that the variant of Islam that they're dealing with on a daily basis is the Wahhabist strain. The Sufis are quietly doing their own thing, so that's not who they're really talking about. And I think if people understood Wahhabism better, then they would use that word instead of Islam. I think one reason this is complicated is because the Wahhabists claim to be true Sunnis. And Sunnis have a long list of reasons why they do not consider Wahhabists to be Sunni. In fact, there's no group of people who actually willingly call themselves Wahhabists. It's kind of a pejorative term, and they don't like being called that because it implies that they learned their ideas from a man, Abdul Wahhab, instead of from the Quran and the Sunnah.
Right.
It's not like there are people actively doing things in the name of Wahhabism. They're actually purporting to be the only form of true Islam. And that's why they call themselves Salafis, because the word Salaf refers to the time period in which the early Muslims lived in the first 300 years after Muhammad and Mecca and Medina and all that. So these people are categorizing themselves as the exemplars of all of Islam. So without more information, people are going to see them and treat them like all of Islam because that's who they're pretending to be, if that makes sense. They're pretending to be the only true Sunnis around. And I think the statistics show that Wahhabis kill more fellow Muslims than they kill Westerners. That's strictly forbidden in my understanding. Isn't violence against other Muslims forbidden? There are clear ways in which Wahhabism differentiates itself from mainstream Islam. The problem is that people don't know that word. People don't know about Wahhabism.
Well, it's also because Saudi Arabia is the main purveyor of that cult.
Yes, correct.
The U.S. is very much in bed with them.
Yeah, the Clinton Foundation received $20 million from Saudi Arabia in the last year. The links between these two are transparent. There's endless documentation on the links between the House of Bush and the House of Saud. Absolutely. And the media who would otherwise be informing us of these distinctions has done such a woefully inadequate job because they're either infantilizing us or they're pushing a certain narrative. So the media is complicit in this lack of understanding as well. Unfortunately, that's who most people go to gain understanding, and then when they fail to receive understanding, they don't know who else to go to because every other source has been treated as false or conspiracy theory and other pejoratives that prevent understanding from being acquired and acted upon. I think people are very right and legitimized in their resistance to Wahhabism. I can't really find one good thing about it. It's interesting how the world's notion of Islam has changed in the last 20 years. When I was a kid, it was all just Aladdin, basically. When you thought of Islam, you thought of Aladdin. And that's very benign. People had a very benign cultural attitude towards Islam.
Well, I don't know. Aladdin was pretty brutal towards Muslims and Arabs. If you watch the documentary, I think Jeremy recommended it to me. It's called Real Bad Arabs.
Real Bad Arabs, yeah.
Who was being mean?
I think Robin Williams. I don't know. I mean, no, not Robin Williams. He was just reading a script, but I mean Hollywood essentially.
I'm down with that.
Yeah.
But hasn't it changed how that happens in the last 20 years? Hasn't it become far more intense and far more transparent? You know, because like people generally had pretty apolitical attitudes towards the movie Aladdin. There may have been things embedded in there because there always are with Disney content. But now the kind of portrayal has become a lot darker, a lot more fear-driven in the past 20 years. And it seems like as Wahhabism has increased, the prevalence of people confusing Islam with Wahhabism has increased as well. And now what we see is Islam's portrayed as Wahhabists instead of Muslims being portrayed as Muslims.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think the temperature you were describing is correlating with, the temperature of what's happening geopolitically.
Correct. The movie 300 is the opposite end of the spectrum from Aladdin, where it's so clearly a war propaganda against Persians. It's just plain as day, the tactics involved in the movie 300, compared to Aladdin, which is much more subtle and soft.
Right.
If you do go look at that book or that film, Real Bad Arabs,
Look, we've unlearned many of our prejudices against blacks, Native Americans, Jews, other groups. Why can't we unlearn our prejudices against Arabs? When we think of Arabs, what do we see? What images come to mind? Arabs are the most maligned group in the history of Hollywood. They're portrayed basically as subhuman. We know the mythology. The mythology, namely Hollywood's images of Arabs.
You are late.
1,000 apologies, oh patient one.
You have it then.
I had to slit a few throats, but I got it.
Disney's Aladdin was seen by millions of children worldwide. It was hailed as one of Disney's finest accomplishments. But the film recycled every old degrading stereotype from Hollywood's silent black and white past.
Oh, I come from a land, from a faraway place, where the caravan camels roam, where they cut off your ear if they don't like your face. It's barbaric, but hey, it's home.
The Arab is one-dimensional caricature, cartoon cutouts used by filmmakers as stock villains and as comic relief. And so over and over we see Arabs in movies portrayed as buffoons, their only purpose being to deliver cheap laughs.
I have a weakness for blondes and women without mustaches.
All the stereotypes are here. Too rich and stupid to know the value of money.
Get me 12 sweets. Better yet, the entire floor.
You can see that it wasn't the Arab as the ultimate terrorist, as sort of became very clear more and more in the 80s, the 90s, and the aughts, now. Before, it was a softening up of the Western and American consciousness of the Arabs as a lower culture or a lower class of beings. And so that a lot of that was in there, even in Aladdin. And that's tied up with the geopolitical aims of the ethnic dimensions of Hollywood, especially in the post-World War II and post-founding of Israel era, where the perceived geopolitical enemies of the Jewish state were then taken on by the largely Jewish-owned and run studios of Hollywood to create the Arab and Muslim world as the epitome of the enemy image. And really, although it was more subtle, you can really see this very long-term project of softening up the target by undermining their humanity. So I think that is a key piece of that. But yes, more and more, now it's like the two biggest terrorism shows are 24 and now Homeland. I believe both of those are knockoffs of Israeli television and film. The geopolitical background of a lot of this propagandizing framing of the Arab and Muslim world is becoming very obvious, and that it plays very specific political purposes. You also begin to see that there's the setting of the precursor in the Western psyche of the threat of Islamic terrorism in the heart of Europe. I mean, that was the last season of Homeland. That was scripted just last season. And so that has to be looked at as the deep psyche of the deep state is being run through the media and these longer form things such as television and film. And so I just would sort of say that maybe we should cast a deep bit of shade and critical mindedness towards these sort of less violently offensive categorization of the Arab and Muslim world and the Aladdins of our past.
I'm just pointing out the progression from one to the other, and that it's
an escalation. That's true. You were talking about an escalation.
Exactly.
That's a good point. It does have the look of a frame job, of a scapegoating operation to make all of Islam painted with these highly Hollywoodized scripted videos of beheadings, some of which have been found to actually be fraudulent. Something going on there with Daesh that's probably more explained by 21st century Zionist American politics rather than the history of Islam.
And in addition, yes, the way we've been arming and assisting these militant extremist groups for political proxy reasons against Soviet Union throughout Europe under the Gladio style proxy disturbance. There's a number of reasons why we have facilitated these types of allegiances in the past.
But now it has become obvious to everyone. Last month, Kerry came out and affirmed everyone's suspicions. He called for Syria to be partitioned and said it was part of Plan B if negotiations fail. But in reality, this was always Plan A. Plans to balkanize Syria and Iraq were laid out by former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice in 2006 in Tel Aviv. It was called the Project for a New Middle East. This was a carbon copy of the Oded Union Plan drawn up by Israel in 1982. The plan is to create a bunch of weak mini-states that will be in perpetual war with each other and never united enough to throw back their colonial chains. The powers who started the wars in both Syria and Iraq did it to redraw borders on a map. The blood of millions of innocent people, your sons, our sons, and children, was spilt over this objective. The very fabric of entire nations ripped apart because of these people's plans. The blood, the blood, the blood.
Whether it's fighting the Soviets, or whether it's arming one warlord to help fight the other warlords, or whether it's handing Libya to them because we prefer not to have Gaddafi in there. There's a number of critical points in American foreign policy where we have aided, abetted, and even directly armed these groups and helped spread their toxic ideology. That's certainly the case.
That's a good point.
We've created over and over again the type of power vacuum and instability that allows organizations with beliefs like this to thrive. And we've given them the necessary arms and resources to do so.
The following is an excerpt from a since-deleted Reddit post by an anonymous officer in the United States Air Force.
Diplomatic cables were leaked in reference to the intentions of the United States government to overthrow the government of Syria, Bashar al-Assad. The cables stated that the U.S. intended to install a U.S.-backed puppet government in Syria, and that al-Assad could either step aside and let us do just that, or we would force him out.
Assad basically told the United States to go fuck themselves, and thus began the financial and support campaigns for rebels in Syria on behalf of the U.S. foreign policy that we have conducted many times in the past.
In 2005, General Wesley Clark very publicly stated that shortly after 9/11, the Joint Chiefs of Staff planned the overthrow of 7 countries over the course of 5 years.
What were those countries?
Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and Sudan.
Think about what has happened in those countries over the last 16 years.
Enter John McCain,
the catalyst that was used to finance ISIS.
Sound hard to believe?
You will find a treasure trove of pictures of John McCain in the same room and posing with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, one of the founding members of ISIS. There is also a massive amount of footage of John McCain stating he has friends in the rebellion in Syria and that he is in frequent contact with them.
We provided cash, weapons, and various supplies to the rebel factions. We are still providing this aid to so-called moderate rebel factions to this day, all of which are aligned and have treaties with ISIL.
For those that think that sounds far-fetched, here is a list of over 50 countries that the CIA worked to overthrow in the last 70 years.
Just to set the record straight, this isn't a conspiracy theory. These are countries that were overthrown by the CIA's Special Activity Division and is a part of history, not theory, not made-up bullshit.
This all actually happened and is openly admitted by the United States government and has been documented by multiple reputable sources.
So what about this whole talk that the Syrian government used chemical weapons against civilians and rebels?
That information was found to have been altered by the United States media to garner support for the war against Syria in 2013. The BBC was caught blatantly falsifying evidence and stated that the Syrian government was responsible for the chemical weapons attacks. The mainstream media was forced to drop the narrative after multiple exposés revealed that the media had altered the footage and blamed the Syrian government, when in fact it was the Free Syrian Army and al-Nusra that launched the attacks, a rebel faction that was heavily funded and supplied by the United States government.
The Anglo-American sphere has historically chosen to align itself with Islamic nationalist groups or Islamic extremist groups sometimes to counterbalance or to have a proxy against Arab and or Persian nationalism. That even goes back to the ouster of Mossadegh in Iran. People can go look at even some of the CIA involvement in facilitating Khomeini, but also the long-term British involvement with the Muslim Brotherhood, as covered by Adam Curtis in his documentaries like The Power of Nightmares, that type of thing, or the Israeli intelligence enabling of the early leader of Hamas as a counterbalance to secular Palestinian nationalism.
I'd also like to go a little further back because in 1920, I believe the British redrew the political boundaries of the region then known as the Levant in order to kind of destabilize the region based on false borders that promote this kind of conflicts, the same way colonialist powers redrew the map of Africa to put people in situations to be overcome by ethnic strife and cultural and religious struggles within their own nation state. The geographic borders in these regions were falsified for reasons of promoting conflict.
Is this like Pico Sykes?
Is Pico Sykes a Pokemon?
Dude, I'm gonna flick a ball at you.
Pico Sykes Accord, I think. That was a drawing of the map.
Sykes-Picot.
Sykes-Picot, right,
The Sykes-Picot Agreement.
A secret agreement between the United Kingdom and France where they split the spoils of World War I, what used to be the Ottoman Empire and stuff like that.
Split the booty, they split the booty, split the booty, they split the booty,
yeah.
Split the booty, they split the booty.
Yes.
They split the booty right in half, leaving a big hole in the middle.
Now that's what I call a power vacuum.
The problems in the region are 100 years old this year.
Yeah. Huh? Yeah.
Huh.
So it's no secret to people who understand these historical agreements and strange bedfellows we've made over the century.
So now the question is, who gets to draw their maps? Who gets to draw their own maps, you know?
Who should be the ones fighting ISIS? Because right now, it seems that ISIS is the one trying to redraw the map of Middle East. And that doesn't seem good for anyone involved. Then the other option would be, well, America should go there and blow up ISIS. That's how we got into this problem in the first place. That's not going to work either.
I always thought they were fighting along with ISIS.
Who?
America.
Who?
America.
Yeah, but there's an idea out there that what we need to do is have some sort of military intervention into the ISIS problem.
Carpet bomb them.
That causes the same sort of blowback that allows ISIS to be viable in the first place. So I don't think American intervention is going to solve a problem caused by American intervention. Putin right now is trying to fight ISIS. Another thing is, can the Middle East itself deal with the ISIS problem? Provided that the West stops
supporting them?
Funding it.
Yeah, exactly. You know, so like, how does this problem get dealt with?
It does look, though, that once their support is removed, whether through NATO, Turkey, Israel, US, Saudi Arabia, whoever's sort of like backing them in different ways, many different groups in the area are down to protect themselves and handle their problem.
I think it can't happen any other way.
Yeah.
Anything else is just going to cause the next manifestation of the same problem, but maybe at a higher level of magnitude. We have to kind of get out of there in more ways than one.
Send in Vice. Send in Gavin McGinnis to report on it. To stand up to them.
Send Bill Maher.
Bill Maher can join Benjamin Netanyahu and box them. And kick them out of there them damn self. So one time he went into the audience and kicked someone's ass.
I really love to see the scenario if we were to randomly drop Hillary Clinton somewhere in Syria so she could see.
She'd short circuit.
They're so out of touch, man.
And then Donald Trump can run the reality TV show and tell her whether she's handling it well. Sad. That was sad.
Yes!
Hillary is a mess.
I think if we dropped her off in the Middle East somewhere, I think we'd find out whether or not she really is having low-level seizures.
I have fallen and I can't get up.
Because I was watching these videos last night, albeit they weren't graphic videos, but they're basically videos of just random mercenaries just shooting guns over there, and it sort of like brings you down to realize how like serious and horrific it is over there. The kind of weapons that these guys are being supplied with, it's crazy. Did you guys see that video of her looking at Gaddafi being beaten to death and dying? She looked at the video, she looked at Gaddafi dying, getting shot and beaten to death, and she hands her aide the phone, looks at the interviewer, and goes,
"We came, we saw, he died."
And then cackled.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's psychopathology full on display, dude. The cackocracy.
It's fucked.
Completely fucked.
Look, we came, we saw, he died. We came, we saw, he died. Look, we came, we saw, he died. We came, we saw, he died.
It's not a laughing matter. I take it really seriously.
Vote for me because I'm a woman. One of my merits is I'm a woman. All these mothers vote for me because I'm a woman. Because I'm a woman. Vote for me because I'm a woman. One of my merits is I'm a woman. All these mothers vote for me because I'm a woman. Because I'm a woman.
A woman running to be the first woman president.
I cannot imagine anyone being more of an outsider than the first woman president.
Who can be more of an outsider than a woman president?
Well, I can't think of anything more of an outsider than electing the first woman president.
A woman president of the United States of America.
Another thing I got to watch, which is fascinating, the coup in Turkey.
Oh,
very
wow.
excellent live streams of it.
Oh, wow.
That scenario is really bizarre.
Yeah.
Aside from the very graphic video, the guy alleged to be behind it is a very interesting figure. Fethullah Gulen?
Yeah.
Gulen?
Is he the one that's living here?
He is living here, and he's lived here for
wow.
a long time. I'm looking here at an article from 2014 where he was living in exile, even years ago, even before the coup, after gaining his visa with help from former CIA officials. From Pennsylvania, he's opened over, I believe, 130 madrasas, funding them from the United States. All this is happening. Going back to Gladio, the Turkish military has had a long tradition of periodic coups to kind of resecularize the government in Turkey. But all of those previous coups have all been linked to the Gladio scenarios and Gladio network that we were talking about earlier. The Turkey coup that we watched is another indication of the same problem, the same Western backing of these destabilizing events. Who's benefiting in Turkey from this is Erdogan. He's used it as an opportunity to kind of clear the deck.
Sweep up all of his opponents, yeah. It's a strange one because it has the feel of that it could have been a let it happen on purpose type of scenario where you had a Gulenite NATO West organized potential reset coup that was allowed to go forward by Erdogan to then utilize to clean out his political opponents. It's hard to know what's going on there because there's a lot of, he's sort of making these quick transitions from the NATO West to more towards Russia and Iran. It's hard to know what's going on over there.
We have SIBEL Edmonds' testimony. She was a translator in the post 9/11 period,
or even in the lead up to 9/11, I think. Yeah, right.
Yes, both. And in her work, she came upon some information that disturbed her moral conscience, and she became a highly suppressed whistleblower into these fields of inquiry. Asked about Gulen, the question is Gulen a threat to U.S. interests? And she says,
under the guise of madrasas in Central Asia and the Caucasus, his network is involved in training terrorists from Chechens to other Islamic jihadis in the area. The Bureau had him under investigation since 1998, but they were prevented from pursuing the cases despite all evidence due to direct pressure from the CIA and State Department. How do I know? Some of the case files were under the division where I worked in counterintelligence, and other investigations were being conducted under the FBI's Crime and Terrorism Division.
And then the interviewer asked the next question. Is the CIA using the Gulen network to fund CIA ops in Turkey? Her answer?
They did. It was also a channel for money laundering for their $20 billion worth network. They bring teachers from Turkey. They provide them with decent and high salaries, but then they force them to voluntarily and individually contribute over 50% of their income to their various front charity organizations. I met with several ex-teachers and spoke with them in 2006 and 2008. However, because of overt and covert threats from Gulen's network to their families in Turkey, they were not willing to come forward or go on record. He landed on Turkish government's wanted list and was going to be persecuted for wanting to replace Turkey's secular government with an Islamic Sharia type of government. When he was in Turkey for that and was going to jail, he actually got on a plane and came to the United States and was given immediately a visa to stay.
And the documentation in terms of what this man has been doing, he's like an 82 years old man. He only went through third grade education. First grade, second, elementary school, 3 grades, okay? He has semi-Alzheimer, okay? He's sitting in this castle in Pennsylvania. It's a major castle, and the compound is protected by all these mercenaries and with helicopter security. And this man owns and operates the largest charter school chain in the United States of America. And he is, as far as the reach is concerned in terms of building mosques and training terrorist grounds, this man is much bigger than entire operations conducted by Saudi Arabia under our guidance. But nobody will talk about that in the U.S. mainstream media, even though the facts for it is out there for everyone to see.
It's a clear connection to everything we're saying, to the strategy of tension, to Wahhabism and Western-backed promotion of Wahhabist aims and political goals. That's really what this is about, is that Wahhabism seems to be a political ideology masking itself in a religion. And it needs to kind of be treated as a political ideology used for subversion across the board.
If you go look at some of the investigation that Jan Irvin has done at Gnostic Media regards to some of the CIA's involvement in weaponizing anthropology, in countries where there was a growing secularist, nationalistic autochthonous nationalism that was growing to take control of the national resources and the national political apparatus. They would seed ideas of primitivism, indigenous orthodox arts and that type of thing as a counterbalance to the evolving modernity in a way. This fits into that type of scenario, taking advantage of an orthodoxy, a regionalized nativist orthodoxy, and deploying it as a weapon against evolving nationalist identities.
It's an ongoing social engineering project through the strategy of tension.
Yeah.
And it takes a plurality of forms, but it's a consistent thread throughout modernity. It's counter-progressive. It's counterintelligence in the sense that it runs counter to
intelligence.
Intelligence.
So in a way, what we do is counterintelligence.
What we do is just intelligence, I hope.
But as we've spoken about in previous broadcasts in terms of eumemics and the dark arts of the internet, there is a role to be played by counterintelligence too.
We must protect intelligence from the barbarians at the gates, the occultists of intelligence.
Memetics sure does seem to be an interesting way of fighting back and pushing back against a cornucopia of power differential serving agendas like this. Because there seems to be a real cultural capital in meme world these days. The magic of the meme is real, as we're beginning to slowly learn. Like we talked about before, it's clearly a strategy in this unfolding series of events. And one reason it is so effective is that it's very useful at lampooning an ideology very quickly. And so much of what we see is human beings beset by conflicting, competing ideologies in this zero-sum ideological game. Wahhabism is only one of the corrosive ideologies at play. But regardless of what that ideology is, it can be made ridiculous in a short period of time with a well-placed meme attack. You know, getting back to the election, that seems to be a defining theme of the current election. Other than the theme of old people short-circuiting, the rise of memetic warfare is the other theme.
And what about Brexit?
Brexit as a campaign surprisingly succeeded. Even supporters of the Leave campaign thought it was very unlikely that they'd actually succeed. The reason it prospered was because I think people underestimated the appetite for such a thing, but also because the campaign was very well directed. Calling it Brexit was a successful branding. If it was called anything other than Brexit, I don't know if it would have polled at the same rate, because it became a nice little catchphrase that people could understand. And then secondly, there was a barrage of memetic participation for the Leave side, some of which branded the Remain side as Project Fear, because all the argumentation for a Remain vote stemmed down to fear-mongering of apocalyptic proportions.
That basically everything good would cease to be if Britain left the European Union.
They ran a better campaign on the grassroots level because the people who supported Leave did a much better job of communicating their position, often through memetics, even though the Remain vote had the entire media at its behest.
Oh my god. I think it's time for a tune. You guys pulled it off. I will salute you. You cocks. You actually you did it. Meme magic is real. The meme magic. The meme magic is real. You goddamn motherfuckers did it.
But see, I think I see it as a success of a likely controlled opposition, in a way. It's not about the European Union oligarchs being your friendly keepers, but the Brexit was led in some ways by, there was a closeness to Murdoch and Rothschild Zionism. You know, if it seemed like it was actually in line with other parts of the populist uprising that are anti-war, that are anti-Zionism, then I could sort of see it as an authentic populist win. But I don't see it as that. I see it So this is my concern, is that highly effective eumemics are used for potentially controlled victories or bad ideas, or that type of thing. So that's my concern about that, and I think it would translate to what's happening in the United States.
If a person has an orientation to kind of assume that most of the things that happen are controlled scenarios, then that makes a little sense. But when we look at the phenomenon of Brexit as a whole, I don't know if that is so easily concluded.
I'm just looking at the leadership.
Who do you mean by the leadership?
Like Farage and Boris, what's his name? Those are like Rupert Murdoch baddie boys to me. That's what it looks like.
Farage, this is essentially his life's work. He's been wanting Europe to leave the EU as long as he's been.
For whose end and for what reason?
And I don't want to be rude, but, really, you have the charisma of a damp rag and the appearance of a low-grade bank clerk. And the question that I want to ask, that we're all going to ask is, who are you? I'd never heard of you. Nobody in Europe had ever heard of you. I would like to ask you, President, who voted for you? And what mechanism? Oh, I know democracy's not popular with you lot. You appear to have a loathing for the very concept of the existence of nation states. Perhaps that's because you come from Belgium, which of course is pretty much a non-country.
You can't barrage the Farage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Schultz. Isn't it funny? When I came here 17 years ago and I said that I wanted to lead a campaign to get Britain to leave the European Union, you all laughed at me. Well, I have to say, you're not laughing now, are you? And the reason you're so upset, the reason you're so angry, has been perfectly clear from all the angry exchanges this morning. You, as a political project, are in denial. You're in denial that your currency is failing. You're in denial. Well, just look at the Mediterranean. No. As a policy to impose poverty on Greece and the rest of the Mediterranean, you've done very well. And you're in denial over Mrs. Merkel's call last year for as many people as possible to cross the Mediterranean into the European Union has led to massive divisions between countries and within countries. But the biggest problem you've got, and the main reason the United Kingdom voted the way that it did, is you have, by stealth, by deception, without ever telling the truth to the British or the rest of the peoples of Europe, you have imposed upon them a political union. You've imposed upon them a political union. And when the people in 2005 in the Netherlands and France voted against that political union, when they rejected the Constitution, you simply ignored them and brought the Lisbon Treaty in through the back door.
He hangs out with Murdoch, and the other thing is that they're not authentic Zionism is fully on display. There are elements in the European Union that were actually starting to voice their serious accountability and concerns around Israeli occupation and other crimes. The leadership of the Brexit crew are completely in the bag of the British Zionists.
What evidence do you have to support any of these claims? I mean, first off, hanging out with Rupert Murdoch does not automatically put you firmly in the pocket of a particular agenda.
True.
There's probably a lot of reasons people could hang out with Rupert Murdoch. He could call for a meeting and you take it. It doesn't mean you agree to every term he's offering you. The narrative wherein people in Britain are responding organically to a situation that Europe has become, Occam's razor would lead me to support that conclusion, absent any other clear proof.
I'll try to gather some of the political evidence in terms of their political associations of the Brexiteers, especially in terms of their closeness with Zionism. The evolution of the EDL and, Tommy Robinson, and and his very intense Zionism in support of Netanyahu very publicly. That to me has the feel of the using of a populist moment by inauthentic elements that are not actually sort of telling their hand.
With Tommy Robinson, it's a lot more believable of a claim. There's a clearer connection there with the EDL and the JDL and these type of parallels. 17 million people voted for this, and that probably among those 17 million people there's a variety of reasons. The people campaigning for it, they might have had an allegiance. I'd like to know more about that. But that doesn't mean that the people who voted for it didn't want to leave the European Union for reasons that had nothing to do with Zionism,
for sure,
or Murdoch, but had a lot more to do with the economic realities facing the European economies and Britain as a whole.
I'm sure, and I would assert that that's definitely the case. That's my larger point, though, is that in these authentic moments of populist opposition to the status quo, we can't just do a reactionary politics or a reactionary analysis that if the alleged establishment, is against something, then it means that it's the victory for the people. Because if we know that's how these oligarchs work, they play game theory, they control both sides, and they'll use both sides for an outcome that will always be to their benefit. That's my critique of sort of saying, yay, Brexit, even though, of course, there's an authentic populist revolt against these European Union oligarchs who are largely pieces of shit. There's definitely something in that in terms of the authentic nationalism, the authentic revolt against your overseers, against your transnational oppressors. But at the same time, just because the establishment's against it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for the people.
But then on the other hand, just because a piece of the establishment is for it doesn't mean it's bad for the people.
True, and that's true too.
Because one thing that is clear about the phenomenon is that so much of the establishment was against it. One of the funniest things about this whole Brexit thing along the way was that Barack Obama had his warning speech to the British people on why they should vote Remain. After that speech, Leave started polling through the roof because there was a clear reaction to being told by a foreign leader what to do with your own country. They're tired of it. A lot of people are tired of it for very good reasons.
Osama bin Laden told the American people to vote for John Kerry. That doesn't mean anything.
I don't see what the point is. That was cute, but there wasn't a...
True. And actually, I wouldn't commit to that analogy.
It's hard to say that Obama's speech was a setup so then it could be then manipulated by another... Some of this gets too complex to be the most likely scenario.
Yes.
I do think that there are massively engineered situations and frauds, but that doesn't also mean that organic human victories don't still happen.
They do.
They're not all part of a nefarious plot.
I just don't see them happening at that level yet.
Well, one might have just happened, and if we're unwilling to consider the reality of that, then we're just confirming a bias of a lack of these things. Britain isn't even being allowed to leave the EU right now. Just yesterday, the story came out that the EU is charging a extortion fee of $20 billion to even begin negotiating with Britain.
Dang.
Who in your sane mind would want to be a part of an organization like this? The most stagnant economies in the world are all the EU countries. There's no logical reason to stay at this point other than the fact that Britain has been so heavily threatened by people who don't want them to leave. Regardless of whether some people in the establishment will benefit from a Brexit, that doesn't mean that all of the English people aren't recognizing and coming together to really beat the odds. Bookies were giving Brexit very long odds. People who bet on Brexit probably did come out ahead. That fits kind of the Rothschild paradigm, that's how Rothschild started his fortune. He had early notice of who won World War I believe, told the press that the British forces had lost and such, so the stock market crashed. Rothschild then bought up the market before news broke that British had emerged victorious. That fits the Rothschildian pattern very well, would be that Rothschild could have sold the economy on the fact that this was a very unlikely scenario. Because that first day after the boat came in, the market did plummet very briefly, and during that brief collapse, someone could have easily come in and bought up a huge share of the market at bargain bottom prices.
Didn't Soros used to love to do that type of thing too?
Oh yeah, exactly. There are still people who profit from these type of things. They probably hedged their bets in a very large way. That doesn't preclude, to me, the whole possibility of a victory like that.
I want a clear, unadulterated victory of the people that goes along with an actual platform that people can see where we're going to go with it. I don't see the actual agenda, the platform of the people being laid out in terms of this Brexit vote. I don't see what are the plans, what's the platform, what's the agenda. That's my sense. We need a real we the people's platform where it says exactly what we're for, what we're going to build, who we're throwing off our backs, what we're going to do, you know.
Then write it and convince everyone to agree with it. It's easy to say, but probably difficult to do, right? If it was easy, it would have been done a long time ago.
Yeah.
Well, the basic idea is just they want to leave because not everybody in the union wants the same things, you know. Britain wants something different from what Germany or Austria or whatever wants. I think that's basically the core of it, right?
And the fact that the wealthier economies in the EU have to subsidize the poorer ones. And that all the rich countries in the region are already in the EU. So for the EU to grow, they're going to have to continually admit poorer and poorer nations and continually have to lift more and more of the collective economic load if they're going to be a shared economy. Yeah, on top of that, you have the fact that Turkey is kind of sitting on several more waves of troubled migrants and is using them to extort the EU to admit them in the next 10, 15 years. And at the same time this is happening, you've got a Western-backed Gulenist Islamist coup in Turkey. The future of the EU, when you really look at all the pieces, the EU has no future. So the time to get out is now.
I completely understand that level of their thought, you know. But at the same time, like the British people, if they're serious about an answer to the wave of migration, they should immediately stop supporting Zionist-goaded wars in the Middle East. They should try their war criminals, and then they should seal their borders if they're serious about it. But they're not yet. And meanwhile, the real solution to the European Union is for the nations and the peoples of the nations of the European Union to throw off the global oligarchs that control the European Union and declare the debt to be a debt that's not to be repaid, and to throw off a weaponized monetary system and put in a monetary system that creates a race to the top. Debt should not be a problem when there's so much work to do, there's so many people to do it, there's so much technology, there's so much potential. This is a complete fraud that somehow, you know, everyone's just going to set up this resentment politics of these poor countries that we're trying to drag along. You could have the benefits of a European Union, which includes sort of like an ability to exchange money across borders really quickly, to be able to travel across borders really quickly, which are really cool for we the people's sovereignty. Before we're British or before we're German, we're human beings. We want to be able to travel, trade, and you also then rebuild national identity, you rebuild and rejuvenate national economies. But I'm not seeing that, I'm not hearing that, I'm just seeing these sort of like two reactionary poles and no solution being put forward.
That's how the strategy of tension works, right?
Yeah.
You know? You create the conflict, you've got two poles, which makes establishing a mutual way forward impossible. It's a dialectical trap. And the only way out of a dialectical trap is to find some third way of escape.
An authentic third way.
Exactly. And I agree with everything you said that would be helpful in the region, but if the first thing you want to do in that series of events you just named, if the first thing you want to do is close your borders, who am I to say what England should or shouldn't do with its borders?
Well, because they're still involved in this bullshit in the Middle East. They haven't made things right. They're still involved in some bullshit.
You can close your borders and then stop interfering with the Middle East.
And then try your war criminals.
But for you to say you have to do all these other things first before you even consider closing your borders, then you're removing the right of people to self-determine, like you said they should have.
Fair enough, but it's at the same time, it's a way of like...
If your border is artificially opened by an international body over which you have no real say, you finally escape that body, you can close your borders if you want. That's a people's right to decide. If you continue wars of destruction and imperialism and subterfuge, then of course that's clearly a moral, unethical, inhumane thing to do. They're not mutually exclusive like this.
A lot of times they are. A lot of times that's how the politics works out, though. That's my fear. And this goes back to the United States, is the politics of resentment, the outsider and those below you as the real threat, and where your sort of like courage of identity, you reach the limits of your courage of self-defense and identity to the person who's outside below you. A lot of their plight, the reason they're coming in is because you've been fucking duped and been fearful of your actual rulers, and a lot of them have caused the problem of the people below you and outside of you that are coming into your country because your fucking rulers have destroyed their country economically, politically, physically. So that to me is sort of like the road to fascism in a way, because it's fascism. Authentic fascism has a very populist resentment politics to it. That's what we're seeing. I think that's what we're seeing with Trump. The good thing about Trump, I guess, and the Trump phenomenon, the people who really back him, who are of really good faith, they talk about immigration problems, but at the same time they talk about NAFTA and trade problems. But the way that it's put forward, presented and framed, is that America's getting cheated somehow. It's a dangerous, dangerous road to sort of go down, of just sort of closing off your borders if you're not going to try your own war criminals and buggers. I want to see if they fucking put their buggers in jail and start to get some authentic leadership.
Well, my problem with what you're describing is that you have a problem created by the political leadership of a country. In order to atone for the mistakes of your leaders, who you didn't support, and the agendas they conducted that you didn't support, in order to atone, you have to import all the consequences of those actions. Well, then who suffers from the consequence of that wave of immigration from these unsettled people? The people who didn't actually make these decisions. The British people did not start the war on terror with Bush.
They let the shit happen.
They didn't let the shit happen. They were manipulated badly. They were manipulated badly, and they didn't just let it happen. They may have voted for Blair.
True.
But they didn't vote for the immigration policy. They didn't vote for the war on terror. Blair didn't run on a campaign of starting untold destruction in the Middle East. If he did, they wouldn't have voted for him. The problem is that if after the fact we have a mandatory obligation to import all the people displaced by those events, it's the people of the country who end up paying that second toll. So you have people of the Middle East paying for the crimes of Bush-Blair cartel, and then in the aftermath, you have the citizens of Europe paying the toll. Meanwhile, the leaders still go unchecked because we're afraid to even stop the citizens of these countries from being inundated by that same mistake. It's like we're doubling down on something that was fucking awful in the first place, and now we're bringing it...
Yeah.
The people we're supposed to be representing are the ones who are actually going to be paying this final toll. I think that's compounding inhumanity with more inhumanity.
For sure.
And the other question that hasn't been answered adequately, in my opinion, is importing waves of migrants into another unstable situation. Is that really the best thing for them? Is there not another way to try to fix what we've done without just spreading the instability around further? I think that's likely. If we really put our heads to it, our creative chutzpah, we can find another way to help people and to deal with the consequences of our actions without just moving the problem around.
I just listened to this whole thing, man, and this shit is making my dang head spin. My ears done burnt to a crisp. Elvis was wrong, y'all. We can't go on together without suspicious minds. Do you want to be a hound dog or a human being? Love me tender or get the dang hell out of Dodge, you know what I'm saying? Ain't no hunks of burning love coming out of them drones, tell you what. Only fools rush into the kind of shit we done rushed into, man. Caught in a trap. Can't walk out. All shook up.